We have now come to our final presentation of the afternoon, and it's been a remarkable series of anecdotes and stories and history, much of which I did not know. I was a service dependent for 20 years when my dad, in the 50s and 60s, when my dad, who was a World War II veteran, rejoined in 1950. So I'm learning things I didn't know then. We're going to call on Tom Dorn to introduce our last speaker, John Bullen of the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum. Tom?
Thank you very much.
Before I begin the introduction, I'd like to preface the remarks by saying I was scheduled, as you'll see on your program, to take a different part later on in the program. But last night I was called because the member of the museum committee who would be introducing John is too ill to be here, and I was asked to take his place. And I misunderstood. I thought I was being asked to thank our next speaker. So the words that I have will sound as though I'm thanking him for something he hasn't done yet. So it'll be a little strange. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. John Bullen is a volunteer member of the speaker panel of the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum. Today, we will witness John's enthusiasm, passion really, in presenting his Canadian military aviation history. As a member of the CWHM, he helps to keep alive the memory of Canada's many contributions to war and peace in the air, something the Canadian government doesn't seem interested in doing. Think of HMCS Haida or HMCS Sackville, and many, many other instances where it's been left to the private sector to try and save these things. Think of the obliteration of all the vestiges of the Arrow, gone. I mean, everything had to be destroyed, the drawings, the tools, everything. I could go on all about this, but I can also go all across our country and find volunteers like John rescuing, restoring, and presenting examples of aircraft used by the RCAF. And the key word in that sentence is volunteer. A wee anecdote, if I may. Occasionally, when out and about in the city, I will hear a strange sound coming from the sky. I don't have to look up to find the source. It is the very unique, indeed mesmerizing, sound of 4 Merlin engines powering the Andrew Mynarski VC Lancaster bomber. Now, I'm looking forward to hearing so many things about the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum, so we're going to hear from an expert. John, the podium is yours.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you. Okay, just let me get set up here. You know, I've been on the speakers panel now for over 4 years, and when I thought about doing all of this, my biggest nightmare, and I still think about this from time to time, was to do a presentation on the heels of Ted Barris. So my nightmare is now here. So thank you very much for the invite to be here today on behalf of the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum. Just a show of hands, how many have been there? My job's done. Anyways, thank you. Thank you very much. So, the Canadian Warplane Heritage is home to a number of vintage aircraft flown by the Royal Canadian Air Force. They serve to remind us of the vital role played by the Royal Canadian Air Force over the past 100 years in providing national defense and international peace and security. Last year marked the 50th anniversary of the Canadian Warplane Heritage, a volunteer-based nonprofit organization that has grown to become nationally and internationally as Canada's Flying Museum. This presentation speaks to the history of the museum, highlights some of our aircraft, including the iconic Lancaster bomber. In the late 1960s, Dennis Bradley and Alan Ness were close friends. Both had their pilot's license and flew out of the Toronto Island Airport. Alan Ness was the oldest of the two, and during World War II served as an air gunner with the Royal Canadian Air Force. Bradley, in the late 1950s, was rejected by the Royal Canadian Air Force for pilot training due to his size, but caught the eye and was drafted by the Hamilton Tiger Cats, but elected not to play and instead focused on flying. In the late 1960s, both had a passion for flying and shared a dream of purchasing, restoring, and flying a World War II fighter aircraft. The two young men initially searched for a P-51 Mustang, a fast and powerful premier World War II fighter flown by the Royal Canadian Air Force during and after World War II. However, Bradley and Ness quickly discovered that it would be too expensive and instead started searching for something more affordable. Since buying a World War II iconic fighter was going to take deep pockets, Bradley and Ness approached and were joined by Peter Matthews and John Weir. Both were colleagues of Alan Ness. In 1971, the four of them pooled their resources and formed an initial partnership. I doubt they realized at that time that this new partnership would become the foundation of the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum. John Weir, like Ness, was a World War II veteran. Weir was a Spitfire pilot, shot down in France, and was a POW for 4 years. He spent time in the Stalag III prisoner of war camp made famous by the Great Escape. Having experience working in the mines as a young man in Northern Ontario prior to the war, Weir helped dig some of the escape tunnels. In 1971, the partnership purchased their very first plane, a Fairey Firefly, a World War II British carrier-borne naval fighter and reconnaissance aircraft. In March 1943, Fireflies began serving in the Royal Navy, and in July 1944 saw action against the famous German battleship, the Tirpitz, in Norway. After World War II, Canada acquired Fireflies that were flown from two Canadian carriers, HMCS Warrior and Magnificent. On the heels of World War II, the Royal Canadian Navy used the Fireflies to meet Canada's NATO role in anti-submarine warfare. The Firefly purchased by the partnership was privately owned and located in Wadley, Georgia. In October 1971, barely airworthy, the Firefly was flown from Georgia to the Toronto Island Airport, having no functional navigational equipment or radio to contact the island airport upon arrival. The Firefly flew out of a fog bank, lingering over the Toronto shoreline, landed at the airport unannounced, catching air traffic controllers at the island airport by complete surprise. The Firefly was then flown to the Toronto International Airport for an 8-month restoration, financed by the four partners. In June 1972, the fully restored Firefly took its first flight over the skies of the Toronto International Airport. However, the partnership quickly realized that flying a World War II aircraft in airspace around an international airport would be very, very challenging. In 1972, the partnership searched and found a new home when it leased Hangar 4 at the Mount Hope Airport in Hamilton. In October 1972, Bradley flew the fully restored Firefly from Toronto to its new home. The Mount Hope Airport was in many ways a perfect home for the partners. During World War II, the airport, opened in May 1940, was one of over 120 airports across Canada that trained over 130,000 Canadian and Commonwealth aircrew who, after training, were sent overseas. Between 1940 and 1945, over 1,000 pilots, navigators, and wireless operators were trained at the Mount Hope Airport to support the war effort. The partnership established a non-profit organization and called it the Canadian Warplane Heritage. This new organization consisted of 4 friends, 1 World War II fighter plane, and 1 World War II wooden hangar. At the time, the whole notion of a museum was not on the partners' radar screen, but unknowingly, the roots were now set. By 1973, the Canadian Warplane Heritage started taking a bigger interest in buying, restoring, and flying aircraft flown by Canadians during World War II and beyond. The partnership began acquiring planes, including a Harvard, a Tiger Moth, and a Corsair. Local interest in this new organization started to grow. The Canadian Warplane Heritage took on member volunteers to help with the restoration and the upkeep of the planes. And by the end of 1974, 60 volunteer members joined. The Canadian Warplane Heritage started receiving requests from groups to visit and tour the hangar. In need of more space for its growing collection of planes, its restoration work, and the growing need for a dedicated space to receive the public and display the planes, in 1974, the partners purchased the adjoining hangar, Hangar 3, unknowingly, another step towards becoming a museum. Between 1975 and 1976, more planes were acquired, including an Anson and an Avenger. During World War II, the Avro Anson was a workhorse in training aircrew, and between 1941 and 45 would have been the most common aircraft flying out of the Mount Hope Airport. In 1975, the partnership also acquired a B-25 Mitchell. At the end of 1940, the Mitchell medium attack bomber first went into service with the U.S. Air Corps. During World War II, the Mitchell was also used by the Royal Air Force. Hundreds of Canadians crewed B-25s. Crewed B-25s for the RAF, most notably RAF 98 Squadron. The Mitchell was used in every theater of the Second World War. Between 1944 and 1962, the Mitchell served in many roles in the Royal Canadian Air Force, including navigational training, photo reconnaissance, and transport. The museum's Mitchell was built in 1945, but did not see action during World War II. The Mitchell displays the markings of RAF number 98 Squadron that fought over Northwest Europe between 1944 and 45. The Mitchell is dedicated to the many Canadians, both air and ground crew, who served in RAF 98 Squadron. The Mitchell is 79 years old and remains operational. In 1975, the Canadian Warplane Heritage found our B-25 abandoned at the Wilmington Airport in Delaware. It was repaired to airworthiness and was then flown back to Mount Hope for a full restoration. After departing Wilmington and arriving at the Mount Hope Airport, before landing, the B-25 first circled the airport and then flew over one of the runways, opened its bomb bay doors, and bombed the runway with watermelons to announce its arrival. Airport staff were not amused, since the runway had to be shut down due to an inundation of seagulls. In around 1976, the partners started discussing the possibility of acquiring an icon of World War II, a Lancaster heavy bomber. perched on a pedestal in Goderich, Ontario. Through 1975 to 1976, public interest and membership continued to grow, and by 1976, the Canadian Warplane Heritage had 200 members. In 1977, the Canadian Warplane Heritage purchased the Lancaster with the help from a generous donor and with a commitment to restore the bomber to operational flight. This purchase, unlike any other acquisition, brought provincial, national, and international attention to the Canadian Warplane Heritage. More on the bomber a bit later. The same year the Lancaster was purchased, the Canadian Warplane Heritage was struck with tragedy. Alan Ness, a founding member and leader, tragically lost his life flying the Firefly at the 1977 Toronto International Air Show. The Firefly was also lost. Alan's death was a devastating loss for the organization. Given the Firefly's importance to the Canadian Warplane Heritage, in 1978, a second Firefly was purchased from the Camden Air Museum in Australia. The new Firefly arrived a year later and was fully restored by the Canadian Warplane Heritage. The museum's Firefly is painted in the same colors and markings of Royal Canadian Navy 825 Squadron, which flew Fireflies off of the Canadian carrier HMCS Magnificent in the 1950s. The Firefly remains operational today. Given growing local, national, and international interest, in August 1981, the Canadian Warplane Heritage decided to become a museum in name. The museum's flagship plane is the Firefly. An image of the Firefly is embedded in the museum's crest and is the formal recognition of the museum's very first airplane. In February 1993, the museum was struck with tragedy for a second time. The main hangar, Hangar 3, had a devastating fire which partially spread into Hangar 4. The museum's losses were substantial, 5 planes in total, including valuable engineering records. The fire was a devastating loss for staff, members, volunteers, and the local community. During the fire, the museum almost lost the fully restored Lancaster, which had been operational for 6 years. One of the 5 planes lost in the fire was an operational Hawker Hurricane, a fighter bomber built in 1942 by the Canadian Car and Foundry Company in Fort Williams, Ontario. The Hurricane was considered one of the most versatile fighters in World War II, served on more battlefronts than any other RAF fighter, and served in many Allied forces, including Russia. In 1940, the Hurricane fighter secured its place in history for its oversized role in the Battle of Britain. Close to 100 Canadians, pilots, fought in the battle and referred to as, quote, the Splendid 100, with most flying the rugged Hurricane. One of those Canadian pilots was Harold Mitchell from Mount Hope, who was credited with 2 German aircraft destroyed and a 3rd damaged. Between 1939 and 48, the Hurricane served in the Royal Canadian Air Force with squadrons dedicated to Canadian coastal defense and Army cooperation roles, and later in World War II with the RCAF had 7 squadrons of Hurricanes serving overseas. Between December 1939 and 43, the Canadian Car and Foundry Company built over 1,400 Hurricanes at its plant in Fort Williams, with many shipped overseas to supply the war effort. In place of the museum's lost Hurricane, the museum has on display a full-size, detailed fiberglass replica of our original 1942 Hurricane. The replica is painted in the same colors as RCAF No. 1 Squadron that fought in the Battle of Britain. So a quick peek at today's museum. Just give me a second here. In 1996, the museum moved into a new 100,000 square foot Delta wing-shaped hangar, not far from hangars 3 and 4 on land owned by the Hamilton International Airport. In April 26, 1996, the museum was officially opened at that time by Prince Charles. Today, the museum has maintained its status as a nonprofit, volunteer-based organization, and I stand here today on the shoulders of the many thousands of volunteers who built this organization up over the past 50 years. Our mandate is to acquire, preserve, restore, and protect planes, artifacts, and memorabilia from World War II, and to exhibit and educate the public about Canada's rich and innovative aviation history. The museum's collection includes thousands of artifacts and over 40 planes that were crewed by Canadians and with many built by Canadians from World War II forward. Of the 40 planes in the museum's collection, over 15 are in different stages of operational readiness. Our mandate to restore and fly these pieces of Canadian history makes the museum unique in Canada. As I mentioned earlier, John Weir was a founding member of the Canadian Warplane Heritage, a World War II Spitfire pilot and prisoner of war. John had a foundational impact on the museum by ensuring that the aircraft acquired by the Canadian Warplane Heritage would be about remembering the sacrifices of the men who crewed these aircraft and about the women who built and serviced them. Because of John, the aircraft at the museum are a showcase not only of Canada's aviation history, but also of the stories of the people who have fought for Canada. In 1971, as a demonstration of his vision, John donated to the museum a Canadian-built de Havilland Chipmunk. The de Havilland Canada Chipmunk was a post-World War II primary trainer that replaced de Havilland's legendary Tiger Moth that was used to train thousands of pilots during World War II here in Canada and in other Allied countries. In 1952, the Royal Canadian Air Force received delivery of the Chipmunk, which was used to train the many pilots through to the end of the 1970s. The Chipmunk donated by John Weir was built in 1956 in Downsview at de Havilland, Canada. Between 1956 and 1971, the plane was used by the Royal Canadian Air Force to train pilots in Manitoba. The Chipmunk is 68 years old and remains operational today. The Chipmunk that John donated to the museum has a unique registration number, CFPOW. It is a living reminder of not only John Weir's experience as a POW, but more importantly, as a reminder and tribute to the tens of thousands of Canadians who also suffered as POWs during World War II. His donation captures what John stood for and what the museum truly represents at its core. The museum holds a number of events throughout the year, but the most important is Remembrance Day. On November 11th of each year, the museum hosts Canada's largest indoor Remembrance Day ceremony. The event is attended by some 2,000 people, including veterans of past conflicts, including World War II, the Korean War, and the war in Afghanistan, as well as members of the armed forces, past and present, community leaders, and the general public. All are welcome. This ceremony is broadcast each year live on CHCH TV. Most years, weather permitting, as part of the ceremony, the Lancaster flies over the museum at 11 a.m. during the moment of silence when we pay tribute to the fallen. Currently, the museum is restoring an additional 4 planes to flight status. Restoring vintage planes is often costly, demanding, and time-consuming with many setbacks. However, volunteers are not deterred. This picture on the screen is a sign hanging in the museum's restoration area. For over 30 years, the museum has been restoring a Bolingbroke, a World War II mid-sized bomber that were built here in Canada by Fairchild Aircraft in Quebec. During World War II, the Bolingbroke was used by the Royal Canadian Air Force to train aircrew and for maritime patrol. Bolingbrokes were also flown by RCAF 119 Squadron, the Hamilton Tigers, initially based at the Hamilton Civic Airport. During World War II, the squadron was activated and stationed on Canada's east coast and flew coastal and anti-submarine patrols. When complete, the Bolingbroke will be painted in the same colors in tribute to Hamilton's own 119 Squadron. In May 2014, the museum acquired a very special plane from the federal government, a C-47 Skytrain, a military transport plane, and more significantly, a World War II veteran. In 1944, the museum's C-47 was first served with the Royal Air Force, flying over 15 missions, including on the night of June 5th, 1944, when it flew paratroopers over the beaches of Normandy in advance of the D-Day invasion the next day. In September 1944, the C-47 was transferred to the Royal Canadian Air Force 437 Squadron stationed in England, where it flew over 200 missions, including participating in the Rhine Crossing, evacuating some 298 medical casualties, carrying 200 tons of freight, and repatriating 456 prisoners of war. At war's end, the C-47 was flown to Canada. In 1944, while serving in RAF 233 Squadron, our C-47 was given a very special nickname. There were two pilots that flew the plane. Dauber, he was an Australian, and McRae, he was a Canadian, from a small town near Abbotsford, BC. We don't know for sure which pilot was the culprit, but it was rumored that pilot Dauber had a reputation for being very cranky and picky, always complaining to the ground crew about the mechanical integrity of the C-47. The ground crew tried hard to satisfy pilot Dauber, but it was never enough. His complaints and whining were relentless, and he was driving the ground crew nuts. From sheer frustration, the ground crew got together and decided that they needed to send pilot Dauber a direct message. One day when pilot Dauber was off base, the ground crew got a large can of white paint, a paintbrush and ladder, and climbed up to the port side of the C-47 and painted a name on its nose just below where pilot Dauber sat. What they painted were a bunch of letters that, when you enunciate each letter from left to right, forms an expression. This is a picture of what the ground crew painted on the nose of Dauber's C-47. It's hard to read, so I have enlarged this image on the next slide so that you can read it for yourself. I'll get you started. Quit sure bitching. During the museum's restoration of the C-47, signatures were discovered on the inside of the fuselage, about 8 or 9 in total. Research to date revealed that 2 of the signatures are those of World War II vets. One of the signatures belongs to British serviceman Charles Stanley Pryor, who was wounded in France in 1945 and evacuated by Quit Your Bitchin'. After 2 years of searching, the museum made contact with his daughter, Jenny Harrington, living in Dorchester, England. With 2 free first-class tickets from Air Canada on June 9th, 2022, Jenny and her close friend, Rosemary, flew to Canada and visited the museum. Jenny was able to board the C-47 to see her father's signature. Her father's picture now hangs beside the signature in the fuselage. As many of you know, the museum is home to an operational Avro Lancaster heavy bomber. Introduced in 1942, the Lancaster became the backbone of Bomber Command and was one of the key factors that turned the tide of the war in favor of the Allies. During World War II, Group 6, the all-Canadian arm of Bomber Command, flew heavy bombers, including Canadian-built Lancasters. Like the Spitfire, the Lancaster is a World War II icon, a symbol of British freedom, and in the eyes of many, a British legend. During World War II, over 7,300 Lancaster bombers were built, most of them in Britain. Canada also produced Lancasters during World War II. We were the only Allied country to do so. From 1943 to August 1945, Canada produced 430 Lancasters. They were built by Victory Aircraft, located in Malton, just north of what is now Toronto International Airport. By 1944, close to 10,000 people worked building Lancasters, including some 2,400 women. The museum's Lancaster, FM213, was produced in July 1945, one of the last off the line. Since the war was winding down, it was not sent overseas and was initially placed in storage. In August 1946, the Museum Lancaster was reconfigured for coastal reconnaissance and search and rescue. In December 1951, it was posted to Canada's east coast, and between 1953 and 1963 flew reconnaissance and patrol missions out of Royal Canadian Air Force bases Greenwood, Nova Scotia, and Torbay, Newfoundland. In October 1963, FM213 was retired by the Royal Canadian Air Force, one of the last Lancasters to be retired, and was flown to the Dunnville Airport to be scrapped. In July 1964, the Goderich Legion purchased FM213, saving it from its demise. The Lancaster was then flown to Goderich, mounted on a pedestal as a war memorial, where it stayed for 12 years, becoming one of Canada's largest bird nests. In July 1977, the museum purchased the Lancaster from the Goderich Legion with the intention to restore the Lancaster back to flight. And in November 1979, it was delivered to the museum by truck and Chinook helicopter. For almost 10 years, the Lancaster underwent a full restoration by a dedicated team, many volunteers, and the support from the community. On September 11th, 1988, the Lancaster took its maiden flight in front of 20,000 people at the Mount Hope Airport, who came from all over the world, surprising many by the overwhelming response. The museum's Lancaster is one of two Lancasters left flying in the world, and the only Lancaster offering rides, and an icon of World War II. The other Lancaster is located in England and is flown by the RAF Battle of Britain Memorial Flight. The museum has been flying a restored Lancaster for more than 35 years. Lancaster flies around 50 times per year, taking passengers on a 1-hour flight. Some last words. The Canadian Warplane Heritage, at its core, provides us with a means to appreciate Canada's significant contribution during World War II and other conflicts, including Canada's rich aviation history. But more importantly, it allows us to remember and pay tribute to the many young men and women who proudly served in the Royal Canadian Air Force, and to the many who did not return from World War II and other conflicts. The Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum exhibits, artifacts, and planes are a living reminder of the devotion, determination, bravery, and sacrifice of the many young women and men who have fought and continue to fight for the freedom we all enjoy today. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for that wonderful illustration of what the Warplane Heritage Museum is doing. Okay, now stay here. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask? Please come to the microphone if you do. If not, you will all make a resolution to rush over to this museum the first chance and to give them your support and to take a look at some of the items that are not only on display but flying.
Yes, sir.
Are there any future acquisitions in the pipeline for the museum?
The museum earlier this year announced what they referred to as the Merlin Project. It's a plan to purchase 4 Merlin-powered aircraft, long-term. Oh, I'm sorry. They announced earlier this year the Merlin Project, and their plans are to purchase over time 4 Merlin-powered aircraft, a Hurricane, a restoration of the Spitfire we have, the Mustang, and a Mosquito. And so it's kind of aspirational. It's a lot of money, $40 million, but I think first and foremost would be the restoration of the Spitfire we have.
So can I ask a more difficult question then, which would be even more money? What is your thinking about jet aircraft preservation?
Wrong guy to ask. I barely understand how my own car is powered, but no, that's not true. But the few times I've asked our ground crew about what's the chances, they said next to none.
Yeah.
We just don't have the resources. We don't have the expertise. We have a couple of guys that flew jets during the war, or I'm sorry, post-war.
You've got non-flying jets. There are flying like Sabres around North America.
Yeah.
Early, anyway.
Yeah,
it's an
I
order of
can't-
magnitude harder, which is why I ask. I don't think there are any flying historical jets in Canada.
Yeah, the one Sabre we had is now stateside, I understand.
What?
So, yeah, I would be very surprised if down the road, I think we're about turning propellers and not spinning turbines.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. There was a question at my table about Jack Finnan. Just very quickly, I think he is Canada's oldest Lancaster pilot. He's 105, and that's him sitting at the Remembrance Day ceremony a couple of years ago at the Warplane Heritage Museum. He actually showed up again this year, and that's amazing that he attends every year. So, yes, sir.
Another somewhat difficult question, and I ask it in the spirit of, I think a lot of war museums have to deal with this sort of question. You've done such a great job at your museum with the Lancaster in particular and other aircraft, restoring them to flight status. There's another aspect of these weapons, and we can't forget that they are weapons of war and they were meant to kill people. How does the museum handle, that side of things?
Very gingerly. I think we have to fall back on what really John Weir pushed for. It's not so much about the planes, it's about the people that flew the planes. And you're absolutely right. They are weapons of war. And I think when we tour people through the museum, we have to be careful. I was told the story a couple of years ago of a tour guide who was taking a group of older women around the museum, and he was speaking to them about the Lancaster bomber, and we certainly don't advocate war, we don't push war by any means of the imagination. I'm not sure exactly what was said, but one of the women stopped him in his tracks and said, "I'm German, and I was on the ground in Germany when these Lancasters were flying over. My understanding of this plane is something completely different than what you're speaking to." But so I think that speaks to the point you're raising, and I think we just have to fall back on John Weir's positioning, in that it's not so much about what the planes did, it's about the people and the crew that flew them.
Well, John, we appreciate your making the trip here. We have a small gift for you to help you with
Thank you very much.
Coca-Cola. Thanks, and come again.
I will. Thank you very much. Thanks again.